Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Mandela School and several of our partners, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar discussion on building resilience against corruption in Africa generally. This is the first pre-SDG summit which we are holding. Prior to this webinar, we held a discussion amongst a few of our partners to try and draw out some of the broad similarities of the post-colonial state, which have given rise to the kind of state capture and corruption which we are witnessing not only in Southern Africa, but across the continent. And out of that, we got some few theoretical trends which we feel are similar in each of the countries that we discussed, but also, of course, their particularities. The first is the form of political settlement which gave rise to the post-colonial state, the post-apartheid state. A second issue is that as a result of the kind of state that emerges out of these post-colonial settlements, the state becomes a kind of zero-sum game for elites, where the private sector is either weak or controlled by a particular racial elite. The state then becomes the center of accumulation through corrupt and opaque practices using public resources or cartels or access to mineral resources in order to build elite accumulation. Thirdly, the importance of civil society groups in fighting for a struggle to keep states accountable. And so with that, I'll introduce you to for our first discussion, our plenary session, an overview of the issues, which will be led by Mark Haywood, who is a well-known South African human rights and social justice activist.
Good afternoon, everybody. This conversation is meant to kick off today's discussions and really get your intellectual juices flowing. To assist us with that discussion, we have three great panelists. I'll introduce them in order of seniority, referring to both possibly age and experience. We have Advocate Vusi Pikoli, probably known to many people on this webinar, a former National Director of Public Prosecutions in South Africa, currently an advisor to the Minister in the Department of Public Service and Administration, and is very well positioned to talk to this subject. Secondly, we have the younger generation represented by Zukiswa Kota. Zuki is an activist and an academic and is based at the Public Service Accountability Monitor, where she's been for quite a number of years in Makanda in the Eastern Cape, but has worked on corruption, the former chairperson of Budget Justice Coalition in South Africa, and has a very noble track record in civil society and accountability. Thirdly, from outside of South Africa is Nancy Mwijay. Nancy is also a governance specialist who has worked in quite a number of countries in Africa, but also outside of Africa, and therefore is in a position to give us a good comparative overview of these questions, and who is currently working for the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of Government in the UK. And I'm going to start the conversation with a focus on South Africa, and perhaps start with Zuki Kota. The question for this conversation presumes that South Africa is resilient against corruption. Do you think, Zuki, that we are developing resilience against corruption? And what do you think perhaps are the components that make for resilience?
The one difficulty in determining the extent to which we are resilient against corruption should really be, as you say, if we look back over the past decade or so, are there improvements or are there regressions? One thing that I think has been quite interesting is to look at people's perceptions of our resilience or people's perceptions of corruption and how they've changed over time. In our context, 64% of respondents in the most recent Global Corruption Barometer have said that they felt corruption was on the increase in South Africa. And I think perceptions are important because very often they are dependent on lived experiences. And on the other hand, or in the same vein, 70% of people felt felt that the government simply was doing poorly in addressing corruption. So on the one hand, there are some very depressing and very clear signs of regression. But on the other, there are some signs that there's meaningful kind of ratification of various international conventions and treaties, both regionally and internationally. So that's some of the sort of good news. But I think there's probably 6 areas which we can touch on in conversation that are some of the kind of indicators of resilience or otherwise. But broadly speaking, I would say it's a mixed bag. We have a lot to be disillusioned about. Before I kind of touch on the 6 key areas, one of the areas is actually the slow pace of reform. Having said that, I think the question of resilience is that there is a presence, there is a kind of a doubling down by civic actors, I should say, but not necessarily met by the meaningful kinds of reforms that we would actually want to meaningfully say, the fight against corruption is gaining traction. So maybe for now, I'll leave it there. There are, I don't know if I should jump into those 6 kind of areas that are in my head roughly kind of categorized.
Hold your 6 areas for a few minutes. Because they'll be very helpful to talk to. But let me see if Vusi, Advocate Pikoli, agrees with you. Resilient or not resilient? Were we captured and uncaptured?
Thank you, Mark. For me, the jury is still out. But as a people, we've always shown resilience from the days of apartheid to where we are today. But of course, there are some people who would want to look at where we are in terms of corruption and want to talk about apartheid corruption. For me, apartheid corruption is not even a measure to look at, given the high standards that we have set for ourselves as a country. The issue is, how are we reacting to corruption that is currently on the rampage in South Africa? We have set up quite a number of institutions aimed at fighting corruption. All those institutions are meant to fight corruption in this country. And for me, the principal issue is that corruption is a violation of our human rights and is an antithesis to economic development. Despite all those blemishes that we have, and despite the disbandment of the Scorpions, I think we still have that commitment to continue the fight against corruption. But as to how far we are succeeding, that's why I'm saying the jury is still out. So for me, it shows that we do have institutions in terms of our constitution, because we should always go back to our constitution, the fundamental law of the land. But if we were to seriously examine what we're getting right now, we are falling short of some of the promises that you have in the constitution, because corruption is an affront to human dignity. Corruption leads to loss of lives, literally. And those are the 2 rights in the constitution which are not capable of being limited. So for me, the jury is still out. We have got the proliferation of structures that seek to fight against corruption. We still need to consolidate and rationalize those structures. If the national anti-corruption strategy that we have come up with again, is anything to go by.
Thank you very much, Vusi, for those opening comments. It strikes me listening to the 2 of you, and I'll ask Nancy to possibly respond to some of this as well. 2 things come to mind. One is that there's a kind of disjuncture between the noise and the change. That there's a lot of noise. Vusi, you use the word proliferation. We have our Zondo commissions and various investigations and lots of statements, but is that matched by a change on the ground? To what extent are we consumed by dealing with the symptoms of corruption? And of course, criminal justice requires that, but not addressing the root causes of corruption. So if you'll just think about those questions, and also Zuki, I don't want to lose your 6 indicators, but I want to turn to an outside eye. So Nancy, If you can say a few words, please.
Thank you very much. And just to respond to Vusi and Zuki is that, first of all, when we look at the South African experience and looking at what is happening in South Africa, I think one of the key things is that South Africa really teaches us is the fact that there is the culture of respecting and adhering to the rule of law, and being able to actually see a state officer being subjected to the rule of law is something that was quite welcome within the continent. The other thing as well is the whole notion around the independence of the judiciary and the fact that there isn't any interference from the executive in terms of just being able to interfere with the work of the judiciary, something that is not quite common in other African countries. And so the accountability of state or former state officials is something that South Africa has really shown us. But there's also the other thing that comes out in terms of looking at what is happening in South Africa. And it's something that has really come out throughout this entire pandemic, which is inequality. How can we be able to really address the systemic issues that has really kept us where we are? Because we have seen that we have really legislated, we have policies. We don't really lack instruments or policies that can be able to help us address some of the corruption issues that we have. However, the challenge remains is that although we've made some traction and some gains in terms of addressing the corruption question, we haven't really changed when it comes to addressing the question of inequality. One of the key things in terms of prioritization, in terms of what the Africans did highlight, was that they needed jobs, they needed health, infrastructure, education, and clean water. These are things that if you look at how corruption has impacted, you will find that corruption permeates around this, especially around the issues around procurement fraud, and even how political elites have sort of, in a way, participated in these particular areas. How can we bring back citizen collective action, but how can we be also address the challenges that they go through each and every day? What kinds of interventions do we need to put in place to be able to change the status quo? Are the tools that we currently have in terms of analyzing and being able to identify the problems that we face when it comes to corruption sufficient enough? Or do we need to be able to look at it from a different perspective? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. So tools to change the status quo and the influence of inequality on behaviors, including corrupt behaviors. And inequality is another thing that we pay a lot of lip service to. But whether we actually do anything about it is another question. That corruption breeds inequality, inequality breeds corruption. Zuki, I'm going to come back to you now. Do these relate to your 6 key indicators? And will your 6 key indicators help us take us forward in the tools that will bring change at the bottom and not just at the top?
I'm afraid not. I shouldn't have raised them at all. Except, I mean, I think to kind of double back on your earlier question about, the noise versus the change on the ground. I think one of the key, areas of intervention, Mark, when we talk about resilience is, in the context of COVID-19, and Nancy has raised this issue of procurement fraud. That's possibly one of the most sort of stark areas that indicate for us the extent to which, anti-corruption mechanisms have worked or have not worked in terms of systems and putting systems in place. We saw very early on that PPE that was bought for 5 times the normal price, quite early on within the context of COVID-19 procurement. Regardless of the emergency context, that really speaks of the extent to which, this systemic change has been achieved. Civil society have worked hard in terms of advocating for transparency and not just in the space of procurement, but in kind of deepening change within the public service, looking at public appointments, for example, having closer public scrutiny of appointments in the National Prosecuting Agency, within the Public Protector's Office, the AGs. All of those are very important public institutions that, if not strengthened, And if not adequately resourced, we're going to see more of the same. And that's another space in which many advocates have really worked hard, is in ensuring that there is adequate kind of fight back against rent seeking and potential kind of deepening of patronage networks that seeks to kind of erode our democracy further. And I think that's a really important space that many people have kind of made meaningful noise in, I would say, Mark, when we really look at the past perhaps 18 months even, in terms of real traction. I'd maybe just also say in relation to the other areas of, noise versus, meaningful change. Another kind of space is the reform within the public procurement space to come back to. And I think there's been, on the one hand, many of us were quite encouraged when, the National Treasury and OCPO put out the draft procurement bill last year. I imagine there were dozens, if not hundreds, of submissions that were made on that front, with the intention of that kind of, seeing its the kind of formulation and so on within the context of the parliamentary space within this year, 2021. That isn't looking likely. And I think what's been disappointing is the kind of silence and the slowness with which that has happened. Yes, there were potentially lots of voices in the space, but that's important. And so I think, again, we come back to this notion of kind of real, strong, resilient voices from this kind of outside of the state, reformers outside of government, and often kind of being combated or meeting barriers within the state that are slower. Lastly, in terms of the resourcing of public entities, I think on the one hand, the appointments that we've seen recently are very encouraging. But when we hear, that there are serious barriers to, meaningful investigation or fast investigation or capacity issues, both from a financial and a human resource space, that likely kind of should ring alarm bells for us when we look forward. We're likely going to be in this position for a good period of time.
Thank you very much, Zuki. Vusi, back to you. I'm sure you've got lots of things to say, but one of the things I'd like to hear from you is how important is civil society to this resilience? Is it possible to have a strong civil society and at the same time build a strong state?
Thanks, Mark. Just allow me a little bit to be a little bit historical.
Yeah.
And talk of colonial plunder of Africa and how that colonial plunder continues post, colonialism in Africa. There's a report by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, a 2020 report that tells us that, Africa is robbed of its resources to the amount of 88.6 billion annually in terms of illicit financial flows. Now, nobody should tell us that Africa is a poor continent. We ourselves are taking money out of the continent. Hence the result you see of inequalities and poverty in Africa. But at the same time, we should be careful not to criminalize poverty, and say because people are poor, they therefore engage in criminal activities. Perhaps, Mark, your question is best answered if we look at the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. This speaks to the role of civil society. And why in some part we have been resilient is because of the role played by civil society, the role played by investigative journalism, which has kept the government on its toes. Secondly, it speaks to the question of professionalism, within the public administration, but particularly within the criminal justice sector, which we should see it as a value chain, one value chain. So we need to make sure that each of those chains work properly so that we have effective collaboration and partnerships. The strategy speaks of enhancing governance, and as I say, the jury is still out. Talking of improving the integrity and credibility, an issue which was raised by Zuki on the question of the public procurement space, where we need to introduce integrity tests particularly for people in the criminal justice sector, because we've got to deal with corruption within the criminal justice sector itself, within the police, within the prosecutors, and of course we've been saved also by the judiciary. But then there are also certain noises coming in that direction. But the last point I want to raise on this issue of resilience also is the ability to have a proper risk management system that we have in place, so that we are able to foretell and prepare for when we are faced with conditions of adversity, so that we can be able to bounce back. Despite all the attempts aimed at hollowing out the criminal justice sector, relatively, we still have very good working parts, but we need to make that a general rule. So civil society has got to play its role, has got to put pressure, has got to work with government. We want democracy, we want development, and we want the promotion and protection of human rights.
So for both you and Zuki, the jury's out, but I'm sensing that you think that we can still win this battle and turn the tide towards social justice. Nancy.
I think it is fair to say that South African experience has sort of taught us that its rule of law and independence of the judiciary is quite central. But let's also reflect on elements of state capture, especially around critical institutions that are responsible for ensuring that corruption does not happen. One of the key challenges that we have seen so far is that even in situations where we've had countries, especially like, for instance, if you take the example of Kenya, where you have an independent judiciary, you find that there are elements within the government that have already been co-opted. And so it makes quite the work around anti-corruption quite difficult. There's also the evidence around also looking at the perception. And so for me, looking at the future and even looking at it at this particular point, the question really is, what are we not getting right, and how can we be able to get that right, especially around addressing the systemic issues? We need to be able to go a step further and try and understand and iterate some of the issues that we are currently facing, especially around the systemic issues like the inequality, the issues that has kept us where we are at, and how to be able to unlock those particular problems.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Lots to reflect on. As I said, this conversation was really just to whet people's appetites for the breakaway groups, which are going to take each of the parts of this discussion further. I'm going to now hand back to Brian to help us move into the further discussions through breakaway groups.
I hope everyone is back in the plenary. I'll start first with Matthias.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, this was a really great session, and the focus was on what can be learned from Africa's experience in strengthening the criminal justice system. And I'm going to try and group the great contributions, starting at the most macro level and then going down to more practical issues that we talked about. And at the very top was really the issue of that we have sufficient structures, but they're often not capacitated. And this will come through in various points just now. So on the one hand, there might be a lack of political focus. So if those who set the tone on what needs to be focused on are not interested in the issues that matter to most of the people, that is obviously a problem. So we heard from case studies in Kenya where focus on corruption worked to an extent. Even in the South African case, corruption might work to focus on corruption might work to an extent, but we might do that at the expense of focusing of serious violent crimes. And so here also comes the issue of capacity. If you only have that much capacity to do things, what do you focus on? Another structural issue is the urban-rural divide, and how depending on where you are, your access to the justice system, the criminal justice system might obviously vary. And while the access to restorative justice, especially in rural areas, might provide an advantage, there is, of course, the problem of how do you reconcile that with the criminal justice system that happens traditionally in urban areas. And that is linked at times to issues of donor policies. Donors might prioritize things that they really that they understand and that they want to emphasize based on their own priorities, but these things might go past the needs of the people in the respective countries. The fourth point is really, we have these systems in place, but often those bodies that are meant to conduct the oversight are not capacitated. I'm going to close by just highlighting a few things around capacity and maybe ending on a more positive note on things that work, or at least have worked to an extent. And we heard examples of some legislation that worked in the case of Malawi and Namibia that has come online. Also in terms of administration, so both Namibia and Malawi have switched to an e-system, so an electronic system, and that has made really positive impacts. One thing that can really be learned from these presentations that we shared is how to learn from other countries. We find innovations in how to improve the criminal justice system in all these countries. It's not always that we have to either look to countries in the north or just to South Africa to look and find innovative solutions.
Thank you, Matthias. Marianne, are you going to report back on that?
Thanks, Brian. I can, and Job is very welcome to add. It's not a magic wand, an anti-corruption agency, that Africa itself has a hybrid of institutions, and that there have been some successes where there have been some dedicated capacity. But the jury's still out in terms of a single agency versus a hybrid of different agencies performing an oversight role. What is key in all of these are adequate resources, independence, leadership, and really the principles of anti-corruption agencies are very, very useful to inform the effectiveness and operation of anti-corruption agencies on the ground in Africa and elsewhere. There was recognition of the very important role of the public consciousness, the public support, the interaction with civil society, but also that there were highly politicized contexts, and those were in some cases impeding prosecutions. There was a need for collaboration and for sharing experience, but on the other hand, regional cooperation has some serious challenges. And then there seems to be a growing emergence of a focus on anti-corruption on the one hand, and sort of money laundering and financial surveillance.
Thank you, Marianne. And I'll move straight to Juliet, I think will be reporting.
Yes, thank you very much, Speaker. The traditional role that CSOs are currently engaged in should continue, but there is a need for new ways to be introduced as well, because there are many issues that require need for new ways, such as technology, the advancement of technology, which is introducing new ways of corruption. And there's also COVID-19, which has brought a different dimension when it comes to corruption. So because of that, really, there is a need for CSOs to sort of like divert from the traditional way they've been doing things. And we also talked about ensuring that CSOs have a functioning access to reliable information, because obviously when dealing with corruption, it is quite necessary to have information that is reliable. CSOs need to connect themselves. They need to connect not just locally, but globally, because in that way they get to see how other CSOs are tackling such issues of corruption. We also looked at the fact that CSOs' space is shrinking, and as a result, they need to empower communities to participate in decision making. There is need to stop the flow of dirty money through illicit means by safeguarding the common good and enabling secret payments, and also enabling gatekeepers such as lawyers, accountants, and many others. We also talked about the need for a bigger space for freedom for CSOs to operate in order to play their role against corruption. The space for CSOs is shrinking, but this really differs because the space is shrinking now. CSOs are sort of like limited. This shrinking could be because of lack of funding or due to many other reasons. If CSOs are going to tackle corruption, obviously they have to check themselves because it has to start with them. There was the issue of trust, that how do CSOs take advantage of the trust that they have from the citizens, the community. CSOs need to understand corruption better than they see it reported in media. It is very important to tackle corruption bottom up than top down. We also agreed that CSOs need to link themselves to a forward-looking perspective when it comes to issues of equality and justice. And it is very important also to understand the legal framework that CSOs use to tackling corruption. If they don't understand the legal framework within their country, then they may face a lot of challenges when they are, trying to fight corruption. It is important to protect whistleblowers, as they are the ones that provide the information of corruption to CSOs.
Thank you, Juliet. Okay, I think we got some very good inputs there from the three groups. So let me come to you, Fonte. What's your impression of the various inputs that you've heard?
Thanks a lot, Brian. I think the inputs have been very interesting because we have cut through quite a bit of the conceptual haze around two big issues here. One, which is resilience, which remains fairly conceptually fluid, and the other of which is corruption, which, depending on how you look at it, integrates quite a few actors, structures, and processes. And often these debates bring me back to Peter Eke's understanding of post-colonial African politics through two publics. If we look at the various publics that we have brought to the fore today, they're definitely formal structures into which civil society has also integrated itself increasingly, but they're equally informal structures which all play roles in corruption within the societies within which we live. And cutting through that, all of these conceptual and methodological hazes has actually brought us into confrontation with forces which are working against corruption by consolidating power through state capture, through a number of political and socioeconomic practices which actually undermine the very institutions of the state, which some of them are actually called to lead. And in other spaces, we find actors promoting anti-corruption campaigns without necessarily seeming to have that broad-based legitimation from society that they need to carry out the struggles. When these come into confrontation, we would have to see the best ways in which policies, processes, and practices are developed and alliances are created with those segments within the institutions, within the civil society, and within even traditional structures, which in fact believe that accountability and legitimacy and representation need to stay uncorrupted in order for us to actually be able to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, but also to deliver on individual as well as our collective aspirations within African societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Fonte. And Nick, let me come to you. You want to make a couple of points there, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I would just like to pick up on that. And I guess I would like to kind of ask us all, what is it that we take from the recent experience around Jacob Zuma in South Africa? And obviously we have competing interpretations of what that was, whether that was a spontaneous uprising versus something planned by 12 individuals and an insurrection. But I think one of the things that it does, and here I'm picking up very much on what Fonte said, is it reminds us that we still have a kind of public battle to win. And my sense is that we're not going to get the political backing for the institutions we're talking about until it's an electoral issue, until it's an electoral cost, and being corrupt leads you to suffer at the elections, because that's when you start to get genuine political will behind this movement. That's when the institutions we're talking about will have the right kind of support environment. And I think in that we need to face up to two issues, which we haven't talked about perhaps a lot today. I mean, one is, how corruption is seen and whether corrupt acts by international standards are always understood to be corrupt by local communities. A lot of the research on corruption messaging that's been published over the last 2 years has found really worrying findings. And the core finding is that most anti-corruption messaging may be doing more harm than good. Because one of the things that doing anti-corruption messaging does is it primes people to think about corruption and how big the problem is. And in a lot of the research that's been done, we've found that if you actually give people the kind of classic anti-corruption messages, one of the things it does is actually increases apathy, and it encourages people to believe that the problem is too big to be solved. Is the way in which we traditionally have done anti-corruption, perhaps reinforcing public perceptions about how big the problem is, that can actually induce apathy rather than inspire performance? And are there ways that we could actually be framing the debate that would be inspiring people more? I think one of the things we need to ask is, what are the messages we can use that really connect it to citizens, that then make them demand it at elections, that then enable the conditions under which our institutions can thrive? And I think the answer to that from the researchers is two things. One, really connecting for people the idea of corruption and their tax payments. And second, really stressing the local impact of corruption and the ability of local communities to do things to resist it. Perhaps again, a combination there of bringing it home to people how this affects them. So I just wanted to flag those things because they're the sort of things that are really coming out of the research on anti-corruption messaging. And I think it is a really interesting question, for us to think about, how do we frame these messages going forwards that we actually inspire people rather than run the risk of generating apathy around these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. I think the importance of both the previous presentations is, how do you articulate an anti-corruption message with a broader program, a broader alternative vision of going forward, which empowers local communities? Joe, let me come to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian, and thanks, Fonte and Nick. I think I'll just pick up from where Nick and one key point that Nick and Fonte made in their remarks. That being, electoral accountability. And I know, of course, Nick's has done a lot of work on this. And the question becomes, where does electoral accountability lie? If you look at the Afrobarometer survey that we've conducted over several years, there is strong support for multi-party elections on the continent, across all times and across all countries. People are supportive of multi-party electoral competition. And they know the value of it, because if you have competition, you're able to select who leads, and then you're able to hold leaders accountable. I think the challenge comes with internal political party dynamics. You only have the option to choose what is presented to you as a citizen. And you choose among alternatives that you did not have control over who actually gets to be nominated within the political parties. So I think the challenge then becomes, even if you are voting for somebody now, you may think that you're going to vote somebody out of power, but then the next time that person might come back and be the better alternative than anybody else. And so if the political parties that we have do not change, I think we have a challenge. No matter what advocacy civil society does, no matter the efforts that everybody else puts in place to make sure that these institutions work, if our political parties are undemocratic, it's going to be difficult to change them. So even though across the continent we know that there's support for multi-party elections, we need to now think about how to reform our political parties. That's just one point I wanted to make. The second one is just thinking about engagements with other actors. And I'm talking from the civil society because that's where I know most. Often when we deal with government civil society engagement, often we forget about the private sector. And the private sector is treated as though these are not good guys, and so let's not engage them. But then we all know that when it comes to political power, economic power, and civil society, this is a tripartite arrangement that needs to have all three legs very powerful. So the private sector is already strong, the political sector is very strong, civil society also needs to be strong, but they also need to engage the private sector to some extent if we want to make sure that our democratic institutions function the way we hope that they would. So political party reform, thinking about private sector engagement, I think are very key for our sustainable development goals.
Thank you, Joe. Two key points there. And thank you to all the groups for the absolutely important points you made in your discussions and brought to the plenary. And with that, I'm just going to step down now and hand over to Faisal to make some closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists, the chairs, the rapporteurs, and thanks also to those of you who've participated in each of the three breakaway sessions. I'd like to really thank all our partners who so readily agreed to join forces on this critical and extremely important project for the continent. And in that regard, I'd like to mention the discussion we've had just now, which is suggestive of the strength of analytical capacity that exists on the continent. I hope that what we have started is a journey that we will be working on together, all of us on the continent who are so committed and hold the principles of democracy so dearly.
Thank you, Faisal.